How's it going, everyone? Welcome back to Boylei Hobby Time. I was recently made aware of a bizarre internet sensation that's been getting crazy amounts of views. Volt the Robot told me to watch Skibidi Toilet and gave me an idea for a diorama based off the series. I watched a few of the episodes and I saw how some of the content could actually work pretty well in a diorama, especially the toilet man who shoots lasers from his eyes. Okay, this video is going to have a bunch of strange sentences that I never thought I would hear or say. So for everyone's enjoyment, let's all just not take ourselves too seriously for about 10 minutes. I needed to turn this cool John Wick action figure into a cameraman. The cameramen are called that because they have cameras for a head, so unfortunately for John here, his head needed to go. This is a nice head though, so I'll save that for later. While we may have a headless body to work with, we also need it to be neckless, so I pulled out the little double ball joint and began doing some surgery with a variety of tools. Of all the tools I used, the rotary tool was definitely the MVP. In his fight against the toilet overlords, our hero needed a pair of plungers, so I cut up an appropriately sized dowel piece and I rounded off the end with an emery board, giving it that nice classic plunger handle look. In order to get our little friend to grasp the sticks a little better, I heated up his hands with a hot air gun and gently squeezed them around the stick while the plastic cooled. After repeating the process to create a second stick, I used a fuel tank from a lunar lander model kit. I sliced off the ends to make the plungeable portion of the plungers. I then drilled a hole in the center and pressed the handles into position. I finally glued the pieces together, and then I stained the handles with a warm brown wash. I also mixed up a plunger rubber red in the airbrush and I applied it to the little domes after masking off the handles. After the plungers were done, it was time to turn this regular man into a cameraman. I broke out the rotary tool again to drill a hole in the neck, and then I pushed a styrene tube in to act as the new mechanical neck. I borrowed a scope from one of the rifles that came with the action figure, and I clipped off one end, which I'll use later as the interior camera lens. The other side will be the secondary camera on the side of the main camera. I broke out some 040 styrene to make the housing for the main camera, and after gluing it together, I sanded down all the edges and seams to clean it up and give it some nice soft edges. Once all the pieces of the tamper-proof housing were done, I stuck the camera into position centered on two styrene rods. And once that had been glued, I slid the front cover frame into position. To hold the camera at the right angle on the neck, I marked out and mounted some brackets. I then attached a box and the secondary camera to the side of the main camera, and I glued the whole thing in place. In order to get some nice glossy camera lenses, I dropped a bead of UV resin into each lens and then I cured them with my UV flashlight. Lastly, I weathered the camera a bit with some washes, I gave the man his plungers, and our cameraman was done and ready to go to war. Now that we're done with the hero, it's time to make the villain. I began with some XPS insulation foam. I used an old masking tape roll to get a nice oval shape. I cut up one oval, as well as a second one exactly like the first one, and two smaller ovals to make up the lower portion of the toilet. I glued the ovals together in their pairs and began shaping them with my utility knife. At this point, I threw on my mask because foam dust is really bad for the lungs. The knife could only get us so far, but at this point we needed to do some sanding to get us the rest of the way. And once all the main shapes were cut out, I hollowed out the interior of the bowl. I carefully cut an outside line that I didn't want anything to go past, and then I ripped out all the material in the middle all the way down to the bottom. I used a torch off camera to smooth the walls a bit. For the lid, I traced the shape of the oval onto more 040 styrene. For the seat, I cut out that same shape again, and I used a compass to get a smaller version of that same shape. I then cut that out and added some feet to the seat before gluing everything together. Even after the sanding, the surface of the foam was still a little uneven and communicates a foam texture. To get a more glossy surface, I coated the whole thing in UV resin. To finish the bowl, I mixed up some plaster of Paris and I smeared it around the inside using my gloved fingers. I continued doing this as it dried using isopropyl alcohol to get it nice and smooth. Once that was dry, I threw the seat and cover on the back and I took the whole thing outside to prime. I gave the toilet one final coat of UV resin and it was time to prepare the base. For the base, I'm using two gesso boards. I glued them end to end using some wood glue, and I clamped them while they dried. While I wait for that to dry, I'm going to move back to the toilet and I'm going to sculpt the Skibidi Man. In order to ensure that I could get power all the way to the eyes, I ran a tube through the toilet which I could also use as a support for the neck. I made the armature for the face using some aluminum foil, and I kept the back of the head separate from the face so that the wiring wouldn't be as difficult later on. I drilled some holes where the eyes will be, and I glued 2 tiny tubes in place, and then it was time to break out the polymer clay. I sliced up a chunk of clay and began flattening it out so that I could spread it over the face armature. I don't work with polymer clay that often, but when I do, I enjoy it. Unless I don't, then I stay away from it for a long time, which is why I don't work with polymer clay very often. Once the base layer of the face was on, I added the features, including the cheeks, the nose, and the eyebrows. I then began poking and scraping and sculpting till I had an uncanny, distorted expression like I was hoping for. Once the face was done, I covered the back of the head armature with a layer of clay, and I stuck the 2 parts together. I then sculpted some ears and a jawline. I was aiming for the Skibidi G-Man, but it kind of looks like a poorly sculpted Patrick Stewart. I do apologize that you all have to see that. While the clay was in the oven, I moved back to the base. Most of the Skibidi videos happen in an urban environment, so in order to create some concrete, I used a sheet of corkboard. When I had the shape all cut out, I ripped it into a few pieces and glued it back together onto the base, hopefully creating a nice cracked concrete look. To sell the concrete look even further, I stippled on some plaster across the whole surface using a sponge. It's not usually a good idea to speed up your dry time with a hairdryer because it can cause it to crack, but in this case, I was actually kind of hoping for that. Before priming the base, I made sure to drill a hole for the wires as well as for the switch. And once the plaster was dry, I took the base outside and I primed it gray and white. I then dripped some washes in a variety of colors around the base, and I dabbed it up with a paper towel. This creates a nice multi-tone and kind of natural looking dirt effect. I then put my little switch in place and installed the battery housing which will supply my 2 LED filament noodles with energy. I soldered it to a switch and then ran the wires through the base. By this time, the clay had finished baking and it was time to paint. It already had a flesh base color to work with, so that was nice. I painted the teeth and the eyebrows with a brush, and then I painted the rest of the face with an airbrush. I blushed up his nose and cheeks, and I added some dark colors to the recesses of his eyes and some hair. As I added color to this guy, I watched him go from uncanny Patrick Stewart to uncanny Tommy Lee Jones. I then made sure everything fit properly and it was time for final assembly. I ran the wires through the toilet and mounted an acrylic standoff to hold the cameraman mid-air. I ran some wires through the eyes and connected my filaments. I finished up the wiring on the inside of the head, and the last thing to do was to flip it over and put it in place. After that, I called it good. When Volt the robot told me about Skibidi Toilet, I was not prepared for what I was about to watch. I asked myself, what on earth is Skibidi Toilet and why is it getting these kinds of views? Then I watched it. I'm still wondering why it gets so many views, but at least now I know what a Skibidi Toilet is. That is it for this video. Thank you all so much for watching. Hope you enjoyed. Huge shout out as always to my patrons. You guys are the best. Have an awesome week, everyone. I'll see you next time.